In the autumn of 1949, the Stardust, a state-of-the-art Pullman car carrying America's brightest scientific minds, vanished in the Cascade Mountains. For 70 years, the official story was a tragic but simple act of God. That story held until a high-speed rail construction crew, blasting a new path through solid rock, would uncover that the truth was not buried under a landslide, but sealed behind a wall of deceit, waiting patiently in the dark. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The year was a crucible of post-war ambition. America was racing into the atomic age, and the government had assembled a brain trust of its most brilliant physicists for a project of unprecedented importance. Their work, conducted in total secrecy, promised to unlock a revolutionary energy source. The nation was on the cusp of a new dawn, and these men were its vanguard. Their destination, a clandestine research facility deep within the unforgiving wilderness of Washington State. The chosen theater for this secret journey was the Cascade Range, a formidable landscape of jagged peaks, ancient forests, and treacherous passes. In 1949, it was a realm largely untouched by modern infrastructure, a place where nature's authority was absolute. The mountains were known for their sudden, violent weather and geological instability, a reputation that would soon be exploited to mask an unthinkable crime. Its immense, isolating geography made it the perfect place to hide a secret forever. The Stardust was more than a train car. It was a hermetically sealed laboratory on rails, a rolling fortress of scientific thought. Outfitted with the latest technology, its interior was a world of chalkboards covered in complex equations, humming prototypes, and meticulously organized research papers. It was a self-contained vessel of progress, designed to transport its precious human cargo and their world-changing ideas safely and covertly across the rugged American West, away from prying eyes. At the head of this elite team was Dr. Alistair Thorne, a visionary physicist whose theoretical work was years ahead of its time. He was a man driven not by ego, but by a profound belief in science's power to elevate humanity. Thorne had handpicked his 5 colleagues, each a titan in their respective fields. Together, they represented a concentration of intellectual firepower that the nation could ill afford to lose, their collaboration poised to redefine the very fabric of the 20th century. Their mission was codenamed Project Prometheus, a fitting moniker for an endeavor meant to steal fire from the gods. The research they carried was a paradigm shift, a key to energy independence and technological supremacy that would alter the global balance of power. The stakes were immeasurable, and the secrecy surrounding their journey was absolute. Only a handful of individuals in the highest echelon of government and the military knew the Stardust's route or the true nature of its cargo. Tasked with their protection was Colonel Sterling, a decorated military officer whose calm demeanor and charismatic authority inspired complete confidence. He was the government's chosen guardian, a war hero responsible for the logistics and security of the entire operation. Sterling personally assured the scientists and their families that every contingency had been planned for. He was their shield against any threat, foreign or domestic, and the scientists trusted him with their lives without a moment's hesitation. The last confirmed sighting of the Stardust was on the evening of November 12, 1949, as it rumbled past a remote switching station near the base of Mount Pilchuck. A lone rail worker reported seeing the single brightly lit Pullman car detach from its locomotive and proceed up a classified military spur line into the mountains, just as planned. It was the last time any human eyes, apart from those on board, would see the train car for 7 decades. Hours later, a tremor was felt throughout the region, a deep guttural roar that echoed through the valleys. It was dismissed by locals as a common occurrence in the seismically active range. But this was no ordinary tremor. This was the sound of thousands of tons of rock and earth being violently displaced. This was the sound that would become the cornerstone of a carefully constructed lie, an event that provided the perfect cover for a crime of unimaginable coldness. The official narrative was established with swift and decisive authority. The following morning, a distraught Colonel Sterling emerged from the wilderness, the sole survivor of a catastrophic landslide. He reported that the Stardust and its 6 occupants were buried instantly under an entire mountainside that had sheared off in the night. His harrowing account, delivered with military gravitas, painted a picture of nature's unpredictable fury, a tragedy that no amount of planning could have prevented. An immediate survey of the region seemed to confirm Sterling's story. A massive, freshly formed scar of rock and debris was found, completely obliterating a section of the remote spur line. Geological experts hired by the military declared the area profoundly unstable. They concluded that any attempt to excavate the site would be suicidal, risking the lives of rescue workers and likely triggering an even larger collapse. The Stardust and its brilliant passengers were declared irretrievable. The nation mourned. The loss of 6 of its most promising scientific minds was a devastating blow, a national tragedy chalked up to misfortune. The story dominated headlines for weeks, a somber tale of human ambition laid low by the raw power of the wilderness. Colonel Sterling was hailed as a hero, a man who had bravely faced the unimaginable and survived. His testimony was the definitive and only account of what happened that night. For the families, the pain was absolute and unending. They were left with no bodies to bury, no final goodbyes, only the cold official explanation of a mountain's fury. Alistair Thorne's wife and young children were left to grapple with the ghost of a husband and father entombed deep within the earth. Their grief was compounded by a void of unanswered questions, a wound that could never properly close over a grave that would never exist. The story of the Stardust slowly faded from the public consciousness, as all tragedies eventually do. It became a historical footnote, a cautionary tale taught in engineering classes about the importance of geological surveys. Within a few years, the event was cemented in history books as a tragic accident. The mountain held its secrets, and the world, accepting the official account, moved on, leaving the memory of the 6 men to the Cascade winds. The mystery that lingered was a quiet one, whispered only within the affected families and the scientific community. How could such a meticulously planned operation, overseen by the military, end in such a common disaster? Why was a route through such a notoriously unstable region chosen? These questions were dismissed as the product of grief, a refusal to accept the simple, brutal reality of an accident. The official report was sealed, classified for national security. Over the decades, the site of the supposed landslide became a place of grim legend. Hikers and locals spoke of the Cascade Tomb, a place where the ghosts of progress were forever trapped. The story was a chilling piece of local folklore, a reminder of the untamable power of the mountains. The physical scar on the landscape healed, covered by new growth, just as the narrative became an accepted and unchangeable part of the region's history. The official conclusion offered a kind of cold comfort. An accident, however tragic, was an enemy no one could fight. It was an act of God, random and senseless, which allowed for a sense of resignation. A murder, however, would have been a different matter entirely. It would have implied a conspiracy, a betrayal so profound it would shake the very foundations of the institutions the nation was built upon. But no evidence ever suggested such a thing. The absence of the bodies was the key to the story's longevity. With nothing to contradict the official account, it became unassailable fact. The men were simply gone, their genius and their work consumed by the earth. Their legacy was one of tragic, unfulfilled potential. The wound on the nation's psyche scabbed over, leaving a faint but permanent mark that reminded everyone of the fragility of even the most brilliant human endeavors. Alistair Thorne's family held on to his memory through his letters and scientific notes, which spoke of a future he was certain he could build. His granddaughter, Eris, would grow up with the story of the grandfather she never knew, a brilliant man lost to a force of nature. His disappearance became a formative part of her identity, fueling a passion for uncovering the truth in history's coldest cases, never imagining the greatest case of her life was her own. For 70 years, the silence from the mountain was absolute. The stardust, its occupants, and the revolutionary secrets they carried were considered lost to time, sealed away by a tragedy that was as complete as it was sudden. The official report gathered dust in a classified archive, its conclusions never challenged. The world was built upon the foundation of this accepted truth, a story of loss and the indomitable power of the natural world. The passage of time seemed to guarantee the secret would be kept forever. Witnesses died, memories faded, and the physical evidence was believed to be buried under millions of tons of granite, beyond the reach of any technology. The narrative was perfect in its simplicity and its finality. There was no one left to question the account of the heroic Colonel Sterling, who went on to live a long, celebrated life. The world had forgotten the names of the men inside the stardust, consigning them to a plaque in a government building. They were martyrs to science, their potential forever a matter of speculation. The project they were working on was officially abandoned, its goals deemed too ambitious, its records sealed, and eventually lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of a nation focused on new challenges and new frontiers. The chapter was definitively closed, but time does not erase truth, it merely buries it. The official story, so carefully constructed and cemented into history, had a fatal flaw. It was predicated on the assumption that the tomb would never be found. It relied on the mountain to keep its secret, to hold the evidence of a monstrous betrayal in its cold, silent heart for all of eternity. The narrative was a masterful piece of fiction designed to withstand the scrutiny of its time. It accounted for everything: the missing men, the lost research, the deafening silence that followed. It provided a clean, albeit tragic, resolution. What the architect of this lie could never have accounted for, however, was the relentless march of progress 70 years later. And who, after all, had benefited most from a tragedy that left no witnesses? The year 2019 brought with it a different kind of ambition, not of atomic secrets, but of speed and connection. A high-speed rail project, a marvel of modern engineering, was carving a new artery through the Cascade Mountains, seeking to tame the same wilderness that had claimed the stardust. The work was routine, a symphony of heavy machinery and controlled explosions, each blast redrawing a map that had been set in stone for millennia. Progress was measured in tons of granite displaced and miles of track laid, a relentless march forward into the future. A crew of seasoned engineers prepared for another blast near the base of Mount Pilchuck, a location miles from the officially recorded site of the 1949 landslide. Their target was a massive, stubborn rock face that defied their tunnel-boring machines. They drilled deep into the mountain's core, packing the boreholes with powerful emulsified explosives. The protocols were precise, the calculations exact. For the foreman, Dave Schmidt, it was just another Tuesday, another day of moving a mountain, piece by piece, according to a blueprint. The warning siren echoed through the valley, a shrill cry that sent birds scattering from the ancient pines. The crew retreated to a safe distance, the air thick with anticipation. With a press of a button, a low thud vibrated through the earth, followed by a deafening roar as thousands of tons of rock and earth erupted from the mountainside. A plume of gray dust billowed into the sky, a momentary cloud that obscured the sun before slowly beginning to settle back to the earth, revealing the fresh wound they had inflicted on the landscape. As the dust cleared, the crew moved in to assess the results. The blast had been a success, shearing away the rock face exactly as planned and opening a cavernous new space for the tunnel. Schmidt walked the perimeter, his boots crunching on freshly shattered stone, inspecting the geological integrity of the newly exposed wall. It was then that one of his younger crew members called out, his voice a mix of confusion and awe. He was pointing at something deep within the newly formed cave, something that didn't belong. Amid the jagged, chaotic gray of raw granite, there was a patch of impossible smoothness and color. A deep, oxidized crimson, streaked with silver. It was perfectly flat, unnervingly artificial. Schmidt ordered his team to hold back as he cautiously approached the anomaly. Wiping away a layer of fine dust, his gloved hand revealed a series of rivets and a thick, shatterproof window, miraculously intact. It was the side of a vehicle, impossibly entombed within what should have been solid primordial rock, a place where nothing man-made could ever be. Slowly, carefully, the crew began to clear the surrounding debris. The shape that emerged from the mountain's heart was unmistakable, a specter from a forgotten era. It was a train car, a single Pullman, its classic lines and elegant construction standing in stark contrast to the brutal rock surrounding it. On its side, the nameplate was still legible, the brass letters tarnished but defiant. Stardust. The foreman, a student of local history, felt a cold dread wash over him. He knew the legend, and he knew it was supposed to be a wreck buried miles away. The site was immediately locked down. Within hours, a convoy of black government vehicles snaked its way up the mountain access roads, their flashing lights cutting through the twilight. The National Transportation Safety Board, the FBI, and military officials descended upon the scene, their faces grim. The discovery of the Stardust was not an archaeological curiosity. It was the unearthing of a classified national secret, a tomb that was never meant to be opened. The official story of a landslide had just been shattered as violently as the rock face that had hidden the truth. News of the discovery reached Dr. Eris Thorne in her forensics lab in Washington, D.C. At 42, she was a leading historical forensic analyst, a woman who made her living by coaxing truths from the silent artifacts of long cold cases. But the Stardust was more than a case. It was the defining myth of her family, the story of the brilliant grandfather she had never met, Alistair Thorne, a man lost to the fury of nature. The official report was a foundational text of her childhood, a story she had accepted as tragic, unchangeable fact. The call came from a senior NTSB official, his voice strained with a gravity she had never heard before. He didn't waste time. Eris, it's the Stardust. A construction crew found it near Mount Pilchuck. It's not a wreck. It's intact. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossibly heavy. Intact. The single word dismantled 70 years of accepted history. The landslide, the violent destruction, the irretrievable loss, it was all a lie. For Eris, the world tilted on its axis. The ghost of her grandfather was suddenly terrifyingly real. Her journey to Washington State was a blur of conflicting emotions. The professional analyst in her was electrified by the challenge, the greatest historical mystery of a generation laid bare. But the granddaughter was overwhelmed by a lifetime of inherited grief, now sharpened into a blade of raw hope and profound anger. She had built a career on uncovering other people's truths, never imagining that the most significant case of her life would be the one that was written into her own DNA, the one that defined her very name. Arriving at the floodlit construction site felt like stepping into a dream. The Stardust sat in the artificial cavern, a silent, magnificent beast pulled from the depths of time. It was exactly as the old photographs depicted, eerily preserved by the cold, dark, airless environment. For 70 years, this car had been an abstract concept, a symbol of loss. Now, seeing it before her, solid and real, Eris felt the full weight of the 70-year silence. This was not a grave. It was a crime scene. The process of breaching the Pullman car was executed with the painstaking precision of a bomb disposal unit. After 70 years, the integrity of the seals was unknown. A small hole was drilled, and air samples were taken. The results came back quickly. The atmosphere inside was almost pure nitrogen. The oxygen had been exhausted long, long ago. With a final agonizing groan of protesting metal, the main door was pried open, revealing the darkness within. Eris Thorne, clad in a sterile forensic suit, was the first to step across the threshold. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The interior was pristine. Chalkboards were still covered in complex equations. Research papers were stacked neatly on desks, and a half-empty coffee cup sat beside a worn leather briefcase. There were no signs of a violent impact, no shattered glass, no twisted metal. There was only an unnerving, profound stillness that spoke not of chaos, but of a slow, quiet end. Then she saw them. The 6 scientists, her grandfather among them, were slumped in their chairs or lying on the floor. They were not victims of a crushing landslide. Their bodies bore no signs of trauma. They looked as if they had simply been overcome by a deep and sudden exhaustion, succumbing to the inevitable as the air grew thin. Iris found herself staring at the face of Alistair Thorne, a man she knew only from faded photographs, and the professional wall she maintained crumbled. This was not an accident. This was a mass grave. The preliminary on-site report from the medical examiner confirmed what Eris already knew in her bones. The cause of death for all 6 men was hypoxia, asphyxiation. They had been sealed inside this metal tube and left to die, their brilliance and their futures extinguished as they slowly ran out of air. The official narrative, a catastrophic, instantaneous landslide, was not just wrong. It was a deliberate, masterfully constructed lie, designed to hide an unthinkable act of murder. The discovery immediately and officially reclassified the Stardust incident. What had been a tragic historical footnote for 70 years was now an active homicide investigation, designated a major federal crime. The case was reopened with an urgency that spanned generations, aimed at a killer who was likely long dead, but whose crime was now screaming for justice from the heart of a mountain. The story of a natural disaster was dead, replaced by the chilling reality of a cold-blooded execution. Iris was placed in charge of the forensic investigation, a role she accepted with a solemn, unyielding resolve. This was no longer just about her family. It was about the families of the other 5 men who had been fed the same lie for 7 decades. It was about correcting the historical record and exposing a betrayal that had been protected at the highest levels. Her personal grief was now a tool, a lens through which she would scrutinize every piece of evidence, every speck of dust in this hermetically sealed tomb. The first official act of the new investigation was to publicly refute the 1949 report. In a press conference that captivated the world, an FBI spokesperson announced that the Stardust had been found miles from its supposed crash site and that all evidence indicated the 6 scientists were victims of foul play. The narrative of a tragic accident was formally rescinded. The mountain hadn't taken them. A person had. The hunt was on for a ghost. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. The story of the Stardust, once a quaint historical tragedy, was now a sensational tale of conspiracy and murder. The heroic figure of Colonel Sterling, the sole survivor who had built a corporate empire and lived a celebrated life, was instantly recast as the investigation's primary person of interest. His harrowing tale of survival, once a testament to human resilience, was now viewed as the potential confession of a master manipulator. For Eris, the path forward was clear, though daunting. She stood before a large evidence board in a mobile command center set up at the site. On one side, she wrote the key elements of the official story: landslide, geological instability, tragic accident, sole survivor, Collar Sterling. On the other side, she listed the new undeniable facts: sealed tunnel, no impact damage, asphyxiation, murder. The chasm between the two narratives was absolute, a 70-year gap built on a foundation of deceit. The central question of the investigation hung in the air, as cold and heavy as the mountain itself. Who could have orchestrated such a monstrous crime? Who possessed the authority to divert a classified military transport, the resources to blast and seal a tunnel, and the influence to fabricate geological reports and sell a lie to an entire nation for 70 years? Every hypothetical path, every logical deduction led back to the one man who had benefited from the tragedy. Colonel Sterling, the war hero, the titan of industry, the sole witness. His testimony had been the bedrock of the official story. Now his account was the key to its undoing. He had provided the perfect cover story, leveraging the mountain's violent reputation to mask his own calculated violence. He had not survived a disaster. He had orchestrated one and walked away, leaving 6 brilliant men to slowly suffocate in the dark while he built an empire on their stolen work. Eris felt a cold fire ignite within her. The passive grief that had been a quiet companion her entire life now hardened into a relentless drive for justice. She was not just solving a crime, she was reclaiming a stolen legacy. Her grandfather and his colleagues were not just victims. They were pioneers whose contributions to science had been erased and usurped. Her investigation would be their voice, speaking out after 7 decades of enforced silence. The forensic team began its meticulous work, cataloging every object within the stardust. Each document, each personal effect, was a potential key. They were searching for a trophy, that one piece of irrefutable evidence that could expose the killer beyond any doubt. In a crime this old, with witnesses long dead, the truth had to lie somewhere within the silent metal walls of the train car itself, waiting patiently to be found by the right person. The team's initial sweep of the car revealed a world of scientific ambition. Blueprints for a device that looked decades ahead of its time were spread across a table. Theoretical papers detailing a new form of energy generation were filed in pristine order. It was clear that the men aboard the Stardust were on the verge of a breakthrough that would have fundamentally altered the course of the 20th century. A breakthrough someone was willing to kill for. The focus shifted to the personal effects of the scientists. Luggage, letters, and photographs were carefully collected. Eris watched as a technician lifted her grandfather's worn leather briefcase from beside his chair. It was surprisingly heavy and secured with a sturdy lock. As they worked to open it, Eris felt a surge of anticipation. This was his, the last thing he had touched. A container holding the final thoughts of a man on the cusp of changing the world. Inside, among neatly organized research notes and personal correspondence, was a heavy lead-lined box. It wasn't a standard piece of scientific equipment from the era. It was custom-built, designed for shielding something delicate from external forces. The team pried it open to reveal a state-of-the-art wire recorder, an early audio logging device. Its presence suggested that Alistair Thorne had been keeping a record, a captain's log of their historic journey into the mountains. A specialist was called in to handle the delicate wire spool. If there was anything on it, and if it was still viable after 70 years, it could provide a direct window into the final moments of the men aboard the Stardust. It was a long shot, a fragile hope against the ravages of time. But in an investigation where every witness was a victim, a voice from the grave might be the only one capable of identifying the monster who had put them there. The discovery of the Stardust was a seismic event, a shock that fractured a carefully crafted historical narrative and promised to finally bring a dark secret into the light. It gave a voice to the silenced and a new mission to the grieving. It was the beginning of the end for a 70-year-old lie. But this discovery was just the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. Of course, here is the script for Block 3, the new investigation written in English, U.S., and following all specified guidelines. The new investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical hum of climate-controlled servers in a mobile command center established near the mouth of the Cascade Tomb. Dr. Eris Thorne stood before a vast digital evidence board, a mosaic of old photographs, newly scanned documents, and 3D renderings of the Stardust. Her mission was not simply to find a killer, but to deconstruct a 70-year-old reality that had been built with the precision of a master engineer. The official 1949 report, a document that had defined her family's grief for 3 generations, was now projected on the main screen. Its every word, every signature, every conclusion reclassified from historical fact to primary evidence in a mass homicide. The first front in this war against the past was geology. The original narrative rested entirely on the premise of a catastrophic landslide at a specific documented location. Eris commissioned a new survey, deploying technologies unimaginable in 1949. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR aerial scans, and deep core drilling were used to create a comprehensive geological model of the entire region. The team focused first on the officially recorded disaster site, the place where Colonel Sterling claimed to have narrowly escaped death. They were searching for the scar of a mountain's fury, the telltale signs of a massive, deep-seated rock failure that would have been required to bury a train car. The results came back within a week, and they were the first official crack in the foundation of the lie. The geological data was unequivocal. There had never been a major landslide at the site Colonel Sterling had identified. The area was, and had been for centuries, remarkably stable. There were signs of minor superficial rockfalls over the decades, consistent with normal erosion, but nothing remotely on the scale necessary to obliterate a section of railway. The mountain that had served as the perfect silent accomplice for 70 years had just provided the investigation with its first material witness, and its testimony was damning. If the official site was a fiction, then what of the actual site? Forensic geologists descended into the newly blasted cavern where the Stardust was found. Their analysis confirmed it was not a natural cave or a fissure created by seismic activity. It was a man-made tunnel, a dead-end spur blasted with intention. The scorch marks and residue found on the rock at the sealed entrance were consistent with military-grade dynamite from the post-war era. Someone had not just found a place to hide the train. They had engineered and built a tomb, a custom-designed grave sealed with a calculated explosive finality. The investigation then turned to the paper trail that had certified the original lie. The 1949 Geological Survey, the one that had declared the area too unstable for any recovery effort, was signed by a lead geologist from a firm called Apex Terrain Consultants, MAIST. Eris tasked a team of forensic accountants to dig into the company's history. What they found was a crucial link in the chain of conspiracy. Apex Terrain Consultants was a short-lived entity founded in 1948 and dissolved in 1951. Its assets, upon dissolution, were absorbed by a newly formed technology startup with a charismatic, heroic founder, Sterling Dynamics, established by Colonel Sterling himself. With the physical evidence and the official report now in direct conflict, Eris turned the full force of the investigation onto the man at the center of the story, Colonel Sterling. He had died in 2008 at the age of 91, a celebrated icon of American industry and a revered philanthropist. His official biography painted him as a tragic hero, a man haunted by the loss of his men, but who channeled his grief into building a better future through technology. The media had canonized him. His name was on university buildings and charitable foundations. He was, by all accounts, an American hero whose integrity was beyond reproach. Aris and her team began to meticulously rebuild Stirling's life, starting from the moment he emerged from the wilderness on November 13, 1949. His testimony from the time was a master class in controlled, charismatic grief. He described the horrifying rumble, the world turning to black, and the miraculous fortune of being thrown clear of the main rock slide. He spoke of his frantic, desperate attempts to dig for his colleagues before realizing the futility of the effort. His performance was so convincing that it became the unassailable truth, a narrative of survival that no one dared to question for fear of disrespecting a hero's trauma. But the new evidence recontextualized every word. If there was no landslide, what was the rumble he heard? It was the sound of the dynamite he had planted. Where were his injuries? The medical report from 1949 noted only minor abrasions and exhaustion, hardly consistent with being thrown clear from a catastrophic geological event. His survival was not miraculous, it was planned. He had not survived a disaster. He had walked away from a murder scene of his own creation, leaving 6 men to slowly suffocate in darkness while he prepared to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The motive, Aris suspected, was buried in the mountain of research papers now being carefully cataloged from inside the stardust. She had teams of physicists and engineers analyzing her grandfather's work, the theoretical framework for Project Prometheus. Simultaneously, she had another team acquiring the foundational patents filed by Stirling Dynamics between 1950 and 1955. The patents that had launched a multi-billion-dollar global corporation and cemented Stirling's legacy as a visionary inventor. She asked a simple question: did the genius of Alistair Thorne and his team end up with Colonel Stirling's name on it? The overlap was stunning, a theft of intellectual property so audacious it was almost unbelievable. The core principles of Stirling's early patents on energy transmission and miniaturized power sources were not just similar to Thorne's research, they were direct, practical applications of the theoretical equations found on the chalkboards and in the notebooks inside the stardust. Stirling hadn't just murdered 6 men, he had stolen a future they had conceived and claimed it as his own. He had buried the creators to become the god of their creation. This revelation shifted the emotional tenor of the investigation. For Aris, it was no longer just about bringing a murderer to justice. It was about historical restoration. It was about reclaiming the legacy of her grandfather and his 5 colleagues, whose genius had been erased from history and attributed to their killer. The crime was not just the taking of 6 lives, but the calculated theft of their contribution to humanity, a lie that had reshaped the technological landscape of the 20th century under a false prophet. The forensic analysis inside the stardust continued with a reverent, almost archaeological intensity. Every fingerprint was lifted, every fiber collected, every document scanned and cross-referenced. The lack of any external damage to the Pullman car was the most glaring piece of physical evidence. There were no dents from falling rocks, no shattered windows from an impact. The only significant structural event was the sealing of the door and the blast at the tunnel's entrance, which had been designed to bring down just enough rock to conceal the opening, not to destroy the car itself. The personal effects of the victims told a story of lives cut short in a moment of quiet work. A half-finished letter from one scientist to his wife spoke of being on the cusp of a breakthrough that would change everything. A photograph of another scientist's young daughter was tucked into a book on quantum mechanics. These were not just names on a victim list. They were brilliant, dedicated men with families and futures, all extinguished for the sake of one man's insatiable ambition. Their silent testament fueled Aris's resolve, transforming her professional duty into a sacred obligation. The question of accomplices became a central focus. Could one man have pulled this off alone? Diverting a classified military train, blasting a tunnel, fabricating geological reports, and managing a federal cover-up seemed too complex for a single individual. The investigation began to probe the early days of Sterling Dynamics, looking for military personnel who left the service to join Sterling's private enterprise shortly after the 1949 incident. A pattern began to emerge. A small, loyal cadre of Sterling's former subordinates from his military unit formed the original executive board of his company. Were these men complicit, or were they simply loyal soldiers following a charismatic leader they believed to be a hero? With most of them long dead, the answers were elusive, but financial records from the era showed unusually large, untraceable cash bonuses paid to these men in the first year of the company's operation. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of a conspiracy of silence, a secret kept for decades through a combination of loyalty, fear, and shared prosperity, built upon a foundation of murder. The narrative of Colonel Sterling, the celebrated hero, was now completely inverted. In the secure confines of the investigation, he was no longer a survivor, but a suspect, no longer a visionary, but a thief, no longer a hero, but a monster of calculated cruelty. The challenge was proving it to the world, to dismantle a public legacy carved in the stone of American history. They needed more than circumstantial evidence and expert testimony. They needed a smoking gun. They needed a trophy, that one irrefutable piece of evidence that could speak for the dead. That hope rested in the most promising artifact recovered from the train car, the heavy lead-lined box found in Alistair Thorne's briefcase. Inside the delicate wire spool of the audio recorder was being painstakingly analyzed in a specialized lab. The technology was archaic, the medium fragile. 70 years in a nitrogen-rich static environment had preserved it, but the process of extracting any sound was fraught with risk. The wire could snap, the magnetic data could be corrupted. The entire case could hinge on a thin, 70-year-old strand of steel wire. As the technical team worked, Aris focused on reconstructing the final 24 hours of the Stardust's journey. She cross-referenced the train's known departure time with the last confirmed sighting at the switching station. She spoke with the descendants of the lone rail worker who had reported seeing the car divert onto the military spur line. His grandson recalled stories of how the old man was pressured by military officials to amend his official report, to be less specific about the timing and the exact track number. He was told it was a matter of national security. This detail was crucial. It demonstrated that the cover-up began within hours of the crime itself. The official narrative wasn't a story created after a tragedy. It was an integral part of the crime's commission. Sterling had planned not only the murders, but the entire 70-year deception that would follow. He leveraged the weight and authority of national security to silence dissent and obscure the facts, ensuring his version of events was the only one that would ever be entered into the official record. The investigation was now peeling back the layers of a conspiracy that went far beyond one man's greed. It implicated the very institutions meant to protect the nation. How high up did the cover-up go? Were senior military figures or government officials aware of what Sterling had done? Or was Sterling such a master manipulator that he used the bureaucracy's own protocols of secrecy against itself, creating a classified cocoon around his crime that no one was authorized to penetrate? The paranoia was palpable. They were not just fighting a ghost, but the shadow of a system that had enabled him. The pressure on Aris was immense. Sterling's still powerful corporation, now run by his descendants, deployed a team of lawyers and public relations experts to discredit the investigation. They publicly decried the desecration of a national hero's legacy, painting Aris as an obsessive granddaughter driven by grief-fueled fantasy. They argued that the new findings were misinterpretations of a tragic but explainable accident, a desperate attempt to rewrite history. The battle was being fought on two fronts, in the forensic lab and in the court of public opinion. Eris ignored the noise. She remained focused on the tangible truth held within the metal walls of the Stardust. The physics scrawled on the chalkboards was the motive. The pristine condition of the car was the evidence of a lie. The bodies of the 6 scientists were the victims demanding justice. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to Colonel Sterling, the image of the man she had grown up reading about, the brave, tragic survivor, had been replaced by the cold, hard face of a killer. The forensic team analyzing the interior of the Stardust made another small but significant discovery. Tucked into a logbook, they found a notation from Alistair Thorne, dated the morning of the disappearance. It noted a last-minute unscheduled route change ordered by Colonel Sterling, citing geological instability on the primary route. It was a minor detail, but it was the first piece of direct evidence showing Sterling was actively manipulating the train's path on the day of the murders, laying the groundwork for his landslide alibi hours before it supposedly happened. This notation was a piece of premeditation. It proved the landslide story was not a desperate invention after an unexpected event, but the pre-planned centerpiece of the entire operation. Sterling had chosen the location for the tomb, and then he had created a fictional reason to divert the train there. He was not just a murderer, he was a meticulous planner, a director staging a grand, tragic play where he would be the only actor left standing for the curtain call. The sheer coldness of the act was staggering. Meanwhile, in the audio lab, the specialist made a breakthrough. They had managed to successfully thread the fragile wire onto a custom-built playback machine. The magnetic signal, though faint, was present. They were ready to attempt the first playback, to listen to whatever sounds had been captured in the final hours of Project Prometheus. The air in the lab was thick with a tension that spanned generations, a mixture of hope and dread. This was the moment the victims might finally get to speak. Aris was summoned to the lab. She stood in the sterile, soundproofed room, watching as the specialist made the final adjustments. This was the culmination of everything, every late night, every dead end, every piece of data that had led them here. The answer to her family's 70-year-old question was potentially encoded on that spool of wire. The voice of the grandfather she never knew, the truth of his final moments, was waiting to be released from its long, silent imprisonment. The investigation had systematically dismantled Sterling's alibi, proven his motive, and uncovered evidence of a wider conspiracy. They had established, beyond a reasonable doubt for themselves, that he was the architect of the crime. But public opinion and the historical record required more. It required absolute, undeniable proof. It needed a confession. And in the absence of a living killer to interrogate, the only confession they could hope for was one he never knew was being recorded. The new investigation had become a race to give a voice to the ghosts of the Stardust. Eris and her team had followed a cold trail of evidence, from the heart of a mountain to the corrupted archives of the past, all leading back to one man. They had exposed the lie that a mountain had killed these men. Now they had to prove who did. The question was no longer simply what happened to the Stardust, but how deep did Sterling's betrayal go, and who helped him bury the truth? The team's focus narrowed to the scientists' personal logs. While Thorne had the wire recorder, the other scientists kept meticulous handwritten journals. In one, belonging to a physicist named Dr. Evelyn Reed, they found an entry from the night before the disappearance. She wrote of a private, unsettling conversation with Colonel Sterling where he seemed unusually interested in the precise location of their most critical data, asking hypothetical questions about how the research could be reconstituted if the original team were unavailable. At the time, she dismissed it as military thoroughness, But now it read like a killer surveying his prize. This journal entry was a bombshell. It provided a glimpse into the psychological manipulation Sterling employed in the days leading up to the murder. He wasn't just their protector. He was gathering intelligence for his heist, confirming that all the necessary components for stealing their life's work were contained within the Stardust. He was ensuring that when he sealed the tomb, he would be sealing every last piece of their research and every witness to its creation inside with them. It was a chilling testament to his methodical planning. The digital reconstruction of the Stardust's interior provided another crucial insight. By mapping the final positions of the bodies, forensic pathologists determined a probable sequence of events inside the car after it was sealed. The men had not panicked. Evidence suggested they continued to work for a time, perhaps believing it was a temporary delay. Then, as the oxygen levels began to deplete, they gathered their final positions, suggesting a calm, resigned acceptance of their fate. They died not in a state of terror, but in a slow, quiet fade into unconsciousness. This detail was perhaps the cruelest of all. Sterling had not granted them a quick death. He had entombed them alive and given them hours in the dark to contemplate their end, to suffocate on the futility of their situation. Eris imagined her grandfather, a man of logic and reason, calculating the volume of air in the car and the rate of its depletion, knowing to the minute how long he and his colleagues had left to live. The psychological torment was an unwritten part of the crime, a layer of cruelty that the official report could never convey. The case against the ghost of Colonel Sterling was now overwhelming. They had motive, means, and opportunity. They had a falsified alibi, a trail of financial corruption, and evidence of a cover-up. They had dismantled the public image of a hero and replaced it with the private reality of a sociopathic genius, a man who had built an empire on the graves of 6 brilliant men. The narrative was complete, the facts aligned. All that was missing was the final, irrefutable proof. Eris took a deep breath as she stood outside the audio lab. The work of the investigators and scientists had been extraordinary. They had solved a 70-year-old crime, piecing together a truth that had been intentionally buried under layers of deceit, classification, and the simple, crushing weight of time. They had honored the dead by meticulously uncovering the facts of their final days. The truth was known, at least within the confines of their command center. But it was not enough to know the truth. The world had to hear it. The investigation had successfully answered the question of who benefited from the silence of the 6 scientists. It was Colonel Sterling who profited financially, professionally, and historically. He had become a legend, while the true pioneers were reduced to a footnote in a tragic story he himself had authored. The new investigation was the epilogue he never wanted written, the final chapter that would recontextualize his entire life, transforming his legacy from one of heroic achievement to one of monstrous betrayal. The team had done its job. They had reconstructed the crime, identified the killer, and established the motive. They had built a fortress of evidence, brick by painstaking brick, around the memory of Colonel Sterling. Now all that remained was to see if the fortress had a voice. They had followed the evidence as far as it could take them, to the door of a soundproof lab where a 70-year-old machine was about to play back a message from the tomb. They had proven that the official story was a lie. They had demonstrated how that lie was constructed and who it was designed to protect. The complex web of deceit, military authority, and corporate greed had been untangled, revealing the cold, simple crime at its center. But the lies of a celebrated man, repeated for decades, take on a power of their own. To defeat a lie that had become history, they needed more than evidence. They needed a voice from the grave. What they were about to hear would either cement their case forever or leave the final truth tantalizingly out of reach. The air in the audio forensics lab was a vacuum, devoid of sound, save for the low electronic hum of the custom-built playback deck. Dr. Eris Thorne stood beside the audio engineer, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Behind them, senior agents from the FBI and NTSB stood motionless, a silent chorus bearing witness to a moment suspended between two centuries. 70 years of silence, 70 years of a carefully constructed lie were about to be broken by a signal captured on a fragile steel wire. The engineer gave a final solemn nod. He pressed a button and the spools began to turn, pulling a voice from the grave into the stark, sterile light of the present. At first there was only the hiss and crackle of ancient static, the sound of time itself. Then, through the noise, a voice emerged, clear and resonant with calm authority. It was her grandfather, Alistair Thorne. Eris closed her eyes, the sound a physical impact, a connection to a man she had only ever known as a myth. He was discussing a complex energy equation with a colleague, their intellectual back and forth, a symphony of genius. The recording was a perfect, pristine window into the final, ordinary moments of Project Prometheus, a snapshot of brilliance captured just before the darkness fell upon them. The tone on the recording began to shift subtly. Another scientist's voice, younger and tinged with concern, questioned a sudden, jarring lurch of the train car. He noted that they were slowing down, entering a tunnel that was not on their approved itinerary. Alistair Thorne's voice returned, attempting to reassure his team, suggesting it was likely a minor, unscheduled stop for a track check. But the confidence in his tone was strained, a thin veneer over a growing seed of professional unease. The men in the Stardust were beginning to sense that the narrative of their journey was being altered without their consent. Suddenly, the recording captured a heavy, metallic clang that reverberated through the car, the unmistakable sound of the main Pullman door being slid shut and locked from the outside. A wave of confusion erupted among the scientists. Their voices, once calm and academic, were now sharp with alarm. They were sealed in. Alistair Thorne's voice cut through the rising panic, calling out toward the door, demanding an explanation from their protector. He called his name, a name that would be etched into history for all the wrong reasons. "Sterling, Colonel, what is the meaning of this? Open this door." A muffled voice responded from outside the car, a voice Eris recognized from historical newsreels, a voice the world had once hailed as heroic. It was Colonel Sterling, his tone devoid of any warmth or humanity, stripped down to the cold, hard calculus of his betrayal. He did not shout. He spoke with a chilling, matter-of-fact clarity, ensuring his words would be heard by the men he was about to condemn to death. His voice, captured with perfect fidelity by the recorder her grandfather had so carefully shielded, was the sound of ambition, untethered from morality, a final, damning judgment. "Your work is too important to be left to the whims of men, Alistair," Sterling's voice declared from the other side of the steel door. The words hung in the silence of the lab, a confession of motive and intent, delivered with horrifying arrogance. Then came the final, brutal pronouncement, the line that would dismantle a 70-year legacy and rewrite the history of an entire industry. "Your work will continue," Sterling stated, his voice as cold as the mountain rock around them. "You will not." It was not an act of passion, but a corporate decision, an execution order delivered like a line item in a budget. The recording captured the stunned silence inside the Stardust, the moment the 6 brilliant men understood their fate. They were not victims of an accident, they were sacrifices on the altar of one man's greed. Before they could react, before another word could be spoken, a new sound tore through the recording, a deafening low-frequency roar. It was the sound of the dynamite charge at the mouth of the tunnel, the explosion that Sterling had passed off as a landslide. The recording peaked with a violent screech of distorted sound, and then there was only the hiss of an empty wire, absolute, eternal silence. In the audio lab, the engineer stopped the playback. The sudden quiet was more profound than the sounds that had preceded it. No one moved. No one breathed. They had just been present at a 70-year-old murder, listening to the killer's own voice pass sentence. Eris opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face, but her expression was not one of sorrow. It was a mask of cold, hard fury and vindication. The trophy was found. The ghost had confessed. The case was no longer about finding the truth. It was about broadcasting it to a world that had been deceived for generations. The subsequent press conference was the most watched global news event of the decade. Eris Thorne stood at the podium, flanked by the directors of the FBI and NTSB. She did not present theories or circumstantial evidence. She simply placed a small digital player on the lectern and addressed the assembled media. For 70 years, the official story of the Stardust has been a tragedy of nature, she said, her voice steady and clear. Today, you will hear the truth from the men who lived it and from the man who ended their lives. She pressed play, and Sterling's cold confession echoed through the hall and out to millions of screens worldwide. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the legacy of Colonel Sterling and the corporation he had built. The recording was irrefutable. It was a voice from a sealed tomb, an unimpeachable witness to a monstrous crime. Sterling Dynamics, a titan of global technology, saw its stock value evaporate in minutes. The public image of its heroic founder, so carefully curated over decades, was shattered, replaced by the portrait of a cold-blooded killer and an intellectual property thief of unimaginable audacity. The name Sterling became synonymous not with innovation, but with a profound and murderous betrayal. The corporation, now run by Sterling's grandson, issued a statement of profound shock and horror, attempting to distance the modern company from the sins of its founder. But the damage was absolute. The very foundation of the company, its core patents, its origin story, its celebrated history, was revealed to be a crime scene. Lawsuits from the descendants of the other 5 scientists followed immediately, not just for financial compensation, but for the historical record to be formally and legally corrected. The empire built on a lie began to crumble under the weight of a 70-year-old truth. For Eris, the public victory was secondary to the personal resolution. In hearing her grandfather's voice, she had finally met the man whose absence had shaped her life. She had fulfilled a silent promise she never knew she had made, to be the one to finally clear his name and restore his legacy. Her work was not just an act of forensic science. It was an act of profound familial justice, a closing of a wound that had been kept open for 3 generations. The ghost of Alistair Thorne, trapped in a false narrative of victimhood, was finally free. The United States government formally issued a posthumous apology to the families of all 6 scientists. In a ceremony at the White House, the president officially nullified the 1949 military report, striking it from the National Archives. A new report, authored by Eris Thorne, was entered into the record detailing the meticulously planned mass murder and the subsequent cover-up orchestrated by Colonel Sterling. The historical record, once carved in the stone of official documents, was now correctly rewritten, acknowledging the crime and honoring the true victims. The patents that had formed the bedrock of Sterling Dynamics were legally and publicly reassigned to the estates of Alistair Thorne and his team. Science journals and history books were revised, reinserting the names of the 6 men of Project Prometheus as the true pioneers of the technologies that had shaped the modern world. Statues of Colonel Sterling were quietly removed from public squares and university campuses. His name was stripped from buildings and foundations, an act of historical erasure meant to correct the 70-year fraud he had perpetrated on the world. The remains of the 6 scientists were recovered from the Stardust with the dignity they had long been denied. A national memorial service was held, attended by the descendants of the men who had been lost. Their bodies were finally laid to rest, not in the cold, anonymous darkness of a mountain tomb, but in graves that could be visited, honored, and mourned. The abstract grief that had haunted their families for decades was at last given a physical place to reside, allowing for a final, painful, but necessary closure. Eris returned to the Cascade Mountains one last time. The site of the Stardust's discovery was now sealed, not as a tomb, but as a protected historical site. The train car itself had been moved to the Smithsonian, a permanent exhibit dedicated to the story of Project Prometheus. She stood looking at the mountain, no longer seeing it as a symbol of her family's tragedy, but as a silent guardian that had kept a secret safe until the world was ready to hear it. It had not been an accomplice to the crime, but the final patient witness. The story of the Stardust became a modern parable, a stark reminder of how easily history can be manipulated and how a single powerful voice can shape reality for generations. It highlighted the profound arrogance of a man who believed he could not only commit the perfect crime, but also author the official story that would exonerate him forever. He had accounted for everything except the one variable he could not control, the relentless, unyielding persistence of truth and the dedication of those left behind to uncover it, no matter how long it took. The conclusion of the Stardust case brought a bittersweet peace. The justice was real, but it was delivered to ghosts and memories. The lives lost could never be returned, and the 70 years of a world built on a lie could not be undone. However, the resolution affirmed a fundamental principle that no crime, no matter how perfectly concealed, is truly beyond the reach of discovery. It offered a sense of order restored, a belief that the moral arc of the universe, though long, does indeed bend toward justice. Eris Thorne's work was done. She had solved the greatest cold case of the century, and in doing so, had found the missing piece of her own identity. She had stared into the heart of a historical darkness and brought back the truth. Her grandfather was no longer just a name in a tragic report. He was a voice, a mind, a hero, whose legacy was finally and irrevocably his own. The emotional weight she had carried her entire life had been lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a promise fulfilled across the vast expanse of time. The final act of justice was a small personal one. Eris visited her grandfather's new grave, a simple headstone that now bore the inscription, Dr. Alistair Thorne, pioneer, visionary. His voice, once silenced, now echoes for eternity. She placed a hand on the cool stone, a final silent conversation with the man she had come to know so intimately. The long winter of her family's uncertainty was over. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, a sense of profound and lasting peace. The legacy of Project Prometheus was now secure. The stolen future had been reclaimed. The names of Thorne, Reed, and their 4 brilliant colleagues were now celebrated in the annals of science, their contributions finally acknowledged. Their story served as a powerful testament to the idea that genius can be murdered, but it cannot be owned or erased. The truth, like the revolutionary energy they sought to unlock, had a power all its own, capable of breaking through even the most impenetrable of barriers. Colonel Sterling's memory was now a cautionary tale. He had achieved everything he wanted, wealth, fame, a place in history, but his entire life's work was ultimately revealed to be a monument to a single, monstrous act of theft and murder. He had built his castle on a foundation of sand, and the tide of truth, though it took 70 years to arrive, had washed it all away, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of his ambition and the infamy of his name. The emotional resolution for the nation was a complex one. It involved a collective reckoning with a celebrated historical figure, forcing a reevaluation of a story that had been accepted as fact. It was a painful but necessary process of acknowledging that heroes can be monsters, and that the most compelling narratives are sometimes the most profound deceptions. The Stardust affair was a lesson in skepticism, a reminder to always question the official story, especially when it is too simple, too tragic, too perfect. For the scientific community, the restoration of the Prometheus team's legacy was a moment of profound significance. It was an affirmation that the pursuit of knowledge is a sacred trust, and that the credit for discovery belongs to those who earn it through intellect and dedication, not to those who would steal it through violence and deceit. The 6 scientists became martyrs not to nature, but to the darker aspects of human ambition, and their story became a permanent part of the ethical canon of scientific endeavor. The final pages of the Stardust Report were closed. The case files were archived, not in a classified vault of secrets, but in the public record, accessible to all. The story was no longer a mystery, but a completed history, its every question answered, its every lie exposed. The sense of finality was absolute, a clean and decisive end to a 70-year saga of loss and deception. There were no lingering doubts, no ambiguities, only the clear, cold light of a fully revealed truth. The resolution brought a sense of catharsis, the deep, satisfying release of a tension that had been held for decades. The wrong had been righted. The scales of justice, long unbalanced, had been set straight. The emotional journey for Eris and for the descendants of all the victims had reached its destination. They could now move forward, not with the heavy burden of unanswered questions, but with the quiet dignity of knowing the full story and seeing justice finally, comprehensively, done. In the end, the Cascade Tomb had given up its dead. The mountain, which had been made an unwilling accomplice to a great crime, had its innocence restored. It had held the secret not out of malice, but with the patient indifference of geology, waiting for the tools of a future age to uncover the truth it held in its heart. The silence of the mountain was not a sign of complicity, but a testament to the fact that some secrets are too heavy to remain buried forever. The resolution of the Stardust mystery resonated far beyond the lives it directly touched. It became a powerful story about the nature of time and memory. It demonstrated that the past is never truly past. It is a living entity capable of reaching out across decades to demand a reckoning. It showed that evidence can be preserved, that voices can endure, and that a single, determined individual can unravel a lie powerful enough to have reshaped history itself. The final emotional beat was one of quiet triumph. The victory was not loud or celebratory, but deep and resonant. It was the triumph of forensic science over historical fiction, of evidence over narrative, of justice over influence. It was a testament to the idea that no wall is thick enough, no tunnel deep enough, and no lie old enough to permanently conceal a crime. The truth, once recorded, simply waits for someone to press play. The story of the Stardust ultimately serves as a profound statement on persistence. It underscores the belief that truth has an inherent buoyancy, a natural inclination to rise to the surface, no matter how much weight is placed upon it. For 70 years, the truth of what happened in the Cascade Mountains was suppressed by power, wealth, and a masterfully crafted lie. But it was never extinguished. It was merely waiting, patiently and silently, for a granddaughter who refused to let the story end with the official report.